You're standing in the grocery store, reading the label on something you didn't even think had sugar in it. Bread, pasta sauce, salad dressing. And there it is, hiding near the top of the ingredient list like it snuck in when you weren't looking. And here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle you. Your brain isn't offended by that, it's thrilled. Somewhere deep in your neural wiring, a very old, very persistent voice is whispering, "Yes, more of that, please." So when did humans actually start chasing sugar on purpose? And why does a substance we now associate with dentist appointments and diabetes still feel like a reward every single time? The answer starts long before agriculture, long before writing, and long before anyone had a word for dessert. Let's start with the body, because just like salt, the craving for sweetness isn't something culture invented, it's something evolution installed. Sweetness in nature almost always signals safety and energy. Ripe fruit is sweet, rotten or unripe fruit generally isn't. Toxic plants are frequently bitter, a built-in warning label millions of years in the making. So a hominin who instinctively sought out sweet-tasting food was, statistically, seeking out calorie-dense, non-poisonous, energy-rich food, a genuinely excellent survival strategy in a world with no supermarkets and no guarantee of a next meal. Researchers studying infant taste preferences, including a well-known set of studies led by psychologist Jacob Steiner in the 1970s, found that newborn babies, only hours old with no prior exposure to sugar whatsoever, reliably respond to sweet tastes with visible relaxation and even something resembling a smile, while bitter tastes produce an immediate grimace. That's not learned behavior. That's factory settings. So if the craving is ancient, when did humans actually start satisfying it on purpose? This is where honey enters the story, and it enters far earlier than most people assume. In a cave called Cueva de la Araña in eastern Spain, archaeologists have documented rock art, estimated to be roughly 8,000 years old, depicting a human figure climbing what appears to be vines or a ladder toward a wild beehive, apparently reaching in to gather honey while bees swarm around the scene. This isn't a symbolic drawing. It's essentially an 8,000-year-old how-to guide, and it tells us something remarkable. Long before anyone planted a single crop, humans were already climbing cliffs and risking bee stings for concentrated sweetness. Honey wasn't a treat invented by civilization. It was worth real physical danger to prehistoric humans, which tells you exactly how strong that ancient craving already was. But here's where it gets strange. Honey gathering wasn't unique to humans at all, and it might not have even started with us. Chimpanzees, one of our closest living relatives, are frequently observed raiding wild beehives for honey in the modern day, sometimes using sticks as tools to extract it, enduring painful stings in the process. Some researchers studying great ape behavior have suggested this kind of honey-seeking likely predates the split between early humans and other great apes entirely, meaning the drive to seek out concentrated sugar might be millions of years older than Homo sapiens itself. In other words, before there was a you reaching for that hidden sugar on the ingredient label, there was an ancestor swatting away angry bees for the exact same neurological reward. The location changed, the impulse didn't. Now here's a way to actually check this claim against physical evidence, rather than just theory, because ancient teeth don't lie. Researchers analyzing dental remains from various prehistoric populations have found that cavities and tooth decay, while present in some pre-agricultural societies due to honey and naturally sugary foods, increased dramatically and consistently once populations shifted toward carbohydrate-heavy agricultural diets and later, sugar-refining societies. A well-documented example comes from populations in the ancient Near East transitioning into early farming, where dental researchers have noted measurably higher rates of cavities compared to earlier hunter-gatherer populations in the same regions, tied specifically to increased starch and sugar consumption. Teeth, it turns out, keep a remarkably honest diary. Long before written records existed, the human jaw was already quietly documenting exactly how much sweetness a population had access to, one cavity at a time. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Honey was actually the only concentrated sweetener most of humanity had access to for the vast majority of history, and that scarcity mattered enormously. Wild honey is seasonal, dangerous to gather, and limited by how many hives exist in a given area. This meant that for tens of thousands of years, sugar wasn't an everyday ingredient, it was closer to an occasional windfall. Compare that to today, where the average person in many industrialized countries can access more refined sugar in a single gas station stop than most of our ancestors encountered across an entire year. The craving never changed. The supply chain around it changed almost unimaginably. And honey gathering wasn't limited to that one Spanish cave painting. Civilizations across the ancient world independently arrived at similar relationships with sweetness, often centuries apart, with no contact between them. In ancient Egypt, tomb paintings and hieroglyphic records dating back over 4,000 years depict organized beekeeping, with honey used not only as food but in religious offerings and even as a component in medical treatments recorded in papyri like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world. Thousands of miles away in Mesoamerica, the ancient Maya independently domesticated and managed colonies of a stingless bee species, cultivating honey for ceremonial use, trade, and food long before any contact with Old World civilizations. Two unconnected civilizations, separated by an ocean neither knew existed, both concluded independently that a sweet, sticky substance defended by insects was worth systematically managing rather than simply stumbling upon. That's not coincidence. That's the same ancient craving expressing itself twice, on opposite sides of the planet, without either side ever comparing notes. But wait, if honey was the only game in town for so long, where did sugar as we know it, the crystallized, refined stuff, actually come from? This is where the story shifts to a completely different plant in a completely different part of the world. Sugarcane is believed to have first been domesticated in New Guinea, with archaeological and genetic evidence suggesting cultivation dating back roughly 8 to 10,000 years, making it one of humanity's earliest domesticated crops, right alongside grains like wheat and barley. Early cultivators in New Guinea likely didn't refine sugarcane into crystals at all. They simply chewed the raw stalks to extract the sweet juice directly, something still done in parts of the world today. From New Guinea, sugarcane cultivation gradually spread westward across Southeast Asia and eventually into India over the following several thousand years, carried along the same trade and migration routes that moved so many other crops across the ancient world. There's a genuinely funny historical footnote buried in this transition, too. When Alexander the Great's forces marched into the Indian subcontinent around 325 BCE, Greek historians accompanying the campaign, including accounts later referenced by writers like Strabo, described encountering a strange reed that produced honey without bees, an almost bewildered description of sugarcane from soldiers who had genuinely never encountered anything like it. Imagine being a battle-hardened Macedonian soldier thousands of miles from home, and the detail that actually makes it into your commander's records is that the plants here apparently make honey without needing insects. It's a small moment, but it captures something important. Sugar wasn't just unfamiliar to early Europeans, it was borderline incomprehensible. Described in the only terms available at the time, borrowed directly from the one sweetener they already understood. And it's in India where the real transformation happened. The moment sugar stopped being a plant you chewed and became a substance you could store, transport, and trade. Historical and archaeological evidence points to India sometime around the Gupta Empire period, roughly 350 CE, as the region where people first developed techniques to boil down sugarcane juice and crystallize it into a granulated, storable form. The Sanskrit word for this crystallized sugar was khanda, and if that word sounds oddly familiar, it should. It's the linguistic ancestor of the modern English word candy. Somewhere in an ancient Indian workshop, someone figured out how to turn a perishable stalk of cane juice into a stable, tradable commodity, and in doing so accidentally created the root of a word that would eventually describe an entire multi-billion-dollar global industry. Here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with. The next time you unwrap a piece of candy, you are technically saying a 2,000-year-old Sanskrit word out loud, and you had absolutely no idea. So once sugar could be crystallized, stored, and transported, how did it actually make its way out of India and into the rest of the world? Slowly, and mostly through trade networks connecting India to Persia and the broader Islamic world. By around the 7th century CE, sugarcane cultivation and refining techniques had spread into Persia, and from there, expanding Islamic trade networks carried both the crop and the knowledge of how to refine it across the Middle East and eventually into parts of North Africa and Southern Europe, including regions of Spain and Sicily, by roughly the 9th and 10th centuries. Arab agronomists and traders during this period significantly improved refining techniques, producing whiter, purer sugar than earlier methods had allowed, and sugar began appearing in medical texts of the era as well. For centuries, it was considered as much a medicine as a food, prescribed by physicians for everything from digestive issues to respiratory ailments. There's another wrinkle worth adding here. Because sugar's arrival in Europe wasn't a single smooth trade route, it was partly a byproduct of warfare. European crusaders traveling to the eastern Mediterranean between the 11th and 13th centuries encountered sugar production firsthand in the Levant, and several historical accounts describe returning soldiers bringing back both the taste for sugar and knowledge of cultivation techniques, referring to it in period writing as a kind of sweet salt. It's a strange thing to consider that one of the reasons sugar eventually became a fixture in European kitchens traces back in part to religious military campaigns that had absolutely nothing to do with dessert. Sweetness, in this case, hitched a ride home on the same ships and roads that carried soldiers back from war. But here's the part that surprises most people. For a huge stretch of this history, sugar wasn't sweetening anyone's morning coffee. It was closer to a pharmacy item than a pantry staple. In medieval Europe, once sugar began arriving via Mediterranean trade routes, it was extraordinarily expensive, often sold not in grocery markets but through apothecaries, alongside genuine medicines. It was so costly that it was frequently reserved for royalty, nobility, and the seriously ill, sometimes locked away in special cabinets the way modern households might lock away valuables or medication. A 13th century European encountering sugar wasn't sprinkling it casually onto porridge. They were far more likely to be receiving it as a prescribed treatment, or witnessing it displayed as a symbol of extreme wealth at an aristocratic banquet, occasionally even sculpted into elaborate decorative shapes purely to demonstrate how much money a host was willing to burn on a single centerpiece. But wait, what changed? Because clearly at some point, sugar stopped being a locked cabinet luxury and became something ordinary people could put in their tea. What happened? This is where the story takes a genuinely dark turn, and it's important not to look away from it. Starting in the 15th and accelerating dramatically through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, European colonial powers established sugarcane plantations across the Caribbean, Brazil, and other parts of the Americas, and the explosive demand for sugar became one of the primary economic engines driving the transatlantic slave trade. Historians estimate that a significant proportion of all enslaved Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic during this period were sent specifically to work on sugar plantations, under brutal conditions that resulted in staggering rates of death and suffering. The sudden global affordability of sugar, the very thing that eventually made it common enough to sit unremarkably on every kitchen table, was built directly on one of the most horrific systems of forced labor in human history. This isn't a footnote to the sugar story. For roughly 3 centuries, it essentially was the sugar story, and any honest account of how sugar became cheap has to reckon with the immense human cost behind that affordability. And the scale of what followed is difficult to overstate. By the 18th century, sugar had become one of the most valuable commodities in global trade, and colonies built almost entirely around sugarcane cultivation, particularly in the Caribbean, generated wealth so immense that some historians have argued individual sugar-producing colonies were, for a period, more economically valuable to their European governing powers than entire other territories combined. This wasn't a minor agricultural side business. It was one of the central economic engines of an entire era of global trade, reshaping shipping routes, banking systems, insurance industries, and colonial policy, all substantially organized around the production and movement of a substance whose entire purpose was to taste good. The infrastructure of the early modern global economy was, in meaningful part, built around satisfying a craving that predates human civilization itself. So by the time sugar reached ordinary European and American households in large quantities, it arrived carrying a history that had almost nothing to do with sweetness, and almost everything to do with power, exploitation, and profit. And this reframes the entire craving we started this video with. A prehistoric human climbed toward a wild beehive because sweetness meant survival. A farmer in New Guinea cultivated the first sugarcane because it was simply a plant worth growing. A worker in Gupta-era India boiled cane juice into crystal because storage meant trade, and trade meant value. A physician in medieval Europe prescribed sugar as medicine because scarcity made it precious. An enslaved person on a colonial plantation harvested that same plant under conditions no ancient beehive climber could have imagined, so that sugar could become common enough for a stranger, centuries later, to stir it into a cup of coffee without a second thought. That single sentence, "sugar in your coffee without a second thought," carries more historical weight than almost anything else you'll consume today. There's also an interesting linguistic and cultural echo worth pointing out here, one that connects back to another ancient craving entirely. Just as salt once gave us the word celery, sugar embedded itself so deeply into language and ritual that it shows up in unexpected corners of human tradition. Sweets exchanged at weddings across cultures from South Asia to the Middle East. Sugar used symbolically in celebrations marking births, harvests, and religious holidays across dozens of unrelated societies. When something becomes valuable enough, humans don't just consume it. They build ceremonies around it, attach meaning to it, and use it to mark the most important moments of a life. Salt marked survival and labor. Sugar, once it became available, marked celebration and joy. Two ancient cravings, two completely different emotional roles, both permanently woven into how humans mark the passage of time. Now here's where the story pivots back to biology, because even after all of this, after honey, after crystallization, after empire, after unimaginable suffering, The underlying human craving driving all of it never actually changed. If anything, industrialization eventually gave that ancient craving something it had literally never had access to before: near limitless supply. By the 19th and 20th centuries, advances in sugar beet processing, alongside continued cane production, allowed sugar to be produced cheaply enough that it stopped being a luxury entirely and became, for many people in industrialized nations, a near-constant background ingredient in daily life. Researchers studying modern diets have noted that per capita sugar consumption in many industrialized countries rose dramatically across the 20th century, reaching levels far beyond anything achievable through wild honey gathering or early cane chewing, precisely because the ancient scarcity that once kept this craving in check simply doesn't exist anymore for most people. But wait, doesn't that create an obvious problem? If our brains are still running ancient software built for a world of scarcity, and our environment is now saturated with the exact thing that software is obsessed with, what happens? This is the tension nutrition researchers have spent decades studying, and it's a fitting counterpoint to everything we've covered. The same neurological reward pathways that once reliably guided a hunter-gatherer towards safe, calorie-dense fruit are now activated dozens of times a day by manufactured products engineered specifically to maximize that reward response, often stripped of the fiber, water content, and nutrients that would have accompanied sweetness in its natural form. Public health researchers have connected rising rates of conditions like type 2 diabetes and obesity across the 20th and 21st centuries, at least in part, to this dramatic mismatch between an ancient craving and a completely modern food environment. It's not that your brain is broken, it's that your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do, in an environment its evolution never remotely anticipated. But what about the assumption that sugarcane was the only path forward from here? Was there ever an alternative that didn't run through plantation slavery at all? There actually was, though it arrived far too late to undo the damage already done. In 1747, German chemist Andreas Marggraf identified that sugar beets contained a crystallizable sugar essentially identical to that found in sugarcane. And decades later, his student Franz Achard developed practical techniques for extracting it at scale, opening the first sugar beet processing factory in the late 18th century. This mattered enormously because sugar beets could be grown in temperate European climates, without tropical plantations, and without the forced labor systems sugarcane cultivation had relied on for centuries. Beet sugar production expanded significantly across Europe in the 19th century, partly accelerated by trade disruptions during the Napoleonic Wars, which cut off access to colonial cane sugar and pushed European nations to invest heavily in beet-based alternatives instead. It's a genuinely strange historical irony. One of the most brutal supply chains in human history was ultimately challenged, at least in part, not by moral reform first, but by a German chemist noticing that a root vegetable happened to contain the same sweet molecule everyone had been fighting a war over. A prehistoric climber reached toward danger for a few mouthfuls of honey. A modern person reaches toward a shelf without even standing up. A prehistoric craving once meant the difference between starving and surviving. A modern craving now meets no resistance at all. No scarcity, no bee sting, no risk, just abundance endlessly available, precisely engineered. The instinct is the same ancient instinct. The world around it has changed almost beyond recognition. None of this means sugar itself is some kind of villain invented by modern food companies out of nothing. It means something a little more unsettling. The craving was always there, patiently waiting in your biology for millions of years, and it took human civilization exactly this long to figure out how to satisfy it completely, permanently, and without limit. What used to require climbing a cliff now requires walking past an unlocked cabinet that never runs empty. So here's the actual twist buried underneath all of this. Sugar isn't really a modern invention at all. It's an ancient, deeply biological craving that spent most of human history being naturally rationed by scarcity, danger, and cost, and only very recently escaped all three restraints at once. Which brings us back to that grocery store aisle, reading an ingredient label you weren't expecting to see sugar on. That small flicker of satisfaction you feel seeing it, there isn't a personal failing, and it isn't new. It's the same ancient circuitry that once sent a human being climbing toward an angry beehive, still running exactly as designed, just in a world that finally stopped saying no. Some cravings are older than agriculture. Almost none of them expected to win this easily.